was your reaction to the findings of this report from the Select Committee?
It's not good for Richard Sharp, and clearly what you want is the BBC chair, whoever he or she is, to have the absolute respect of all the political parties, and that's now a problem. So I think if you leave aside the technical questions about whether Richard Sharp did or didn't declare his interest in the interview process, the real question is, can he now chair the BBC in a way that the public, the people he represents, us, have trust in him, and the political process has trust in him too?
And what do you think about that, Roger? Do you have trust in him?
What I think is not incredibly relevant, but I think if you look at the next few weeks, there's going to be a lot of Boris Johnson in the news. And the chair of the BBC does not write running orders. He doesn't sit there saying, this is the main story and that's the second story. But he is responsible for the overall accountability of the BBC. So if when Boris Johnson is having all the hearings in the Commons about his behaviour during the Partygate affair, there is a political complaint or any complaint from a member of the public about is it fair or unfair to Boris Johnson, can Richard Sharp really be at the head of the accountability process that decides whether there has been a breach of the BBC's codes or not? So my practical question is, can he actually do that? And if there were a complaint about Boris Johnson coverage, would he have to recuse himself from that, or can he do it? And I think when you get into those details about the way it goes forward, that is now the problem. Can Richard Sharp operate in the job?
Yeah, and it's those kind of potential conflicts of interest. I mean, this morning, the Cabinet Minister, Andrew Mitchell, said that it was very much up to the BBC to decide what to do over Mr. Sharp's future. I mean, how does that sort of process work within the BBC? I mean, you obviously know the BBC very well. Let's say there was a complaint made, as you've just outlined, and it did mean that things got tricky for the BBC. Who actually takes that decision about what should happen to a chair?
Well, first of all, I thought Andrew Mitchell was notably lukewarm in his support for Richard Sharp. So it didn't feel like the government was coming racing to Richard Sharp's assistance. On the point, though, ultimately, the chair in this new system the BBC has had for 2-3 years now of having an executive, of having a single board, that Richard Sharp is there on the single board, responsible for the accountability and the public governance of the BBC. So, for instance, although he wouldn't be sitting on lots of job interviews and appointments, he's responsible for, is there fair selection across the BBC? Because that's something that the board would take oversight of. So that's why I think it's quite hard for him to do the day job, because he's there representing the public in the accountability of the BBC. And at the moment, he clearly doesn't have the untrammeled confidence, to put it mildly, of all the public or all the political class.
And as you say, with this Privileges Committee, Boris Johnson's name is very much going to be, in the headlines over the coming months. I mean, do you think this appointment and the way it was done, do you think that's going to further undermine trust that people have in the BBC? Because it does feel like the BBC is having quite a difficult time at the moment.
There's a lot the BBC needs to sort out. The BBC should be and could be better on impartiality. But if I were a BBC journalist now, if Richard Sharp came to be saying, this is how you act in a more impartial way, I'd probably tell him to take a running jump. And I think most BBC journalists would have that view. So there is a practical problem. But one Andrew Mitchell this morning on Laura Kuenssberg's show said that it's a matter for the BBC about whether he continues, which you mentioned, Aisha. I don't think that's right, because ultimately the chair of the BBC is appointed by the government. And although the chair of the BBC can resign, I don't think the rest of the BBC board can pass a motion of no confidence and kick him out when he is a person put in at the very top of the organisation. So I think it ultimately has to be a decision for the Secretary of State, or for, if the MPs want to come back to it, they should do that. And of course, the big underlying point here is that there should not be political appointments to the chair of the BBC. It's too important for that. It's happened a lot in the past. It should stop. The BBC chairman should be unambiguously impartial and independent.
It's interesting you've just made that point, Roger, because actually one of our listeners, Ed Wilson, has just messaged in making the point you've just made, saying it is up to the government, that the BBC does not select its own chair and technically can't sack him. But on your final point there, Roger, about political impartiality and also for balance, it should be said that the Labour Party in the past, when it was in power, put in quite Labour-friendly people into positions, and people argued, you had someone like James Pennell who was in the BBC, so it has kind of gone both ways, this pendulum. When you're looking for somebody at that level, that kind of public appointment at that level, it's quite hard to find somebody who is completely, pure as the driven snow in terms of any political allegiances, is it not?
It is. The reason this case is particularly tricky is because this is a major donor to one political party.
Yeah.
And we find a chum of the Prime Minister. So that's what's difficult. And the fact that he had a chat with Boris Johnson at a stage of the interview process is also not reassuring. But you are completely right that Harold Wilson put in people to annoy the BBC as much as possible back in the 1960s. And the Blair government put in people favourable to Labour. So there's nothing new about it. But I think what you have to do is say, does the person taking the job have an independence of mind and a real stature that makes them capable of transcending the political appointment? So that's one question. The second thing, of course, it'd be much better if all the parties, and certainly if the two big parties, said, we're not going to do this again, we're just going to choose the best person.